Thank you all for joining today's webinar. I'm Jillian Holzer with the Food Program at WRI, and I'm excited to moderate today's discussion. Today, you're going to be hearing from experts about a new World Bank report, which expands on findings from WRI's own World Resources Report, Creating a Sustainable Food Future, showing that vast agricultural subsidies are currently doing little to achieve the goals of feeding the world and fighting climate change. But there is great room for potential. We'll dive into two key questions during this discussion. The first is what is needed and where are agricultural subsidies currently going? And the second is how to put agricultural subsidies to better use. So some of what you will hear today is outlined in a July 21st blog that was authored by Tim Searchinger. You'll have a chance to ask questions of Tim and our other speakers as we dive into this topic. So this webinar is being recorded and will be available on WRI's website on the events tab in the next couple days. So turning to our speakers now, we'll hear short presentations and then open up the discussion to your questions. So our speakers today are Tim Searchinger, who is Senior Fellow at WRI and lead author of Creating a Sustainable Food Future. He is also a research scholar at Princeton University. And we're also joined by David Baldock, who is Senior Fellow at the Institute for European Environmental Policy. Anne is currently having some technical issues. We're hoping that she'll be able to join us. So over to you, Tim.
I'm here.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Anne
is
here.
on. Can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
Jillian, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. This is a summary of a report recently issued that you can see the following multiple authors from. I was the lead author for the World Bank, basically exploring what agricultural subsidies and market support is doing today and what it could do to better to deal with climate change. If you go to the next slide. The first question is, okay, how much money do governments provide for agriculture and where does it go? And if you go to the next slide, and I should say that this report is built on the backs of fantastic work that the OECD does, looking at subsidies, creating a great database. We basically rearranged some of their numbers so it would be more explicitly useful for the purpose we're looking at. But the basic rule is that overall governments that deal with 60%, 2/3 actually, of the world's agricultural production provide around $600 billion per year in some kind of agricultural support. And that is about 30% of the value added of the production value of agriculture. And you begin to see the categories of support. If you go to the next slide, and by the way, that varies. So for example, in Europe, it's 37%. In some other places, it's in the mid-20s, China and the US, but it's substantial in most places. It's important to differentiate two basic categories of support. One is market price supports, and this is support in the way, not in direct government transfers, but rather through boosting market prices above what would be there without government efforts. And that usually involves some kind of an import tariff, typically with some kind of additional price controls and financial aid as well to kind of keep the market in balance with those import tariffs. And that's about $300 billion. And then there's another $300 billion that comes in some form of direct payment. And you can see where they're going. Of that, 21% are the pure payments to farmers for income. Then you see a variety of others. Input subsidies are 2%. That's things like fertilizer subsidies. Infrastructure is 8%. About half of that is irrigation. Most of the rest of that is some kind of farm level support to have barns or irrigation equipment or something like that. And you then start to see that fairly small amounts of money are devoted to the things that are most likely to contribute to mitigating climate change. Our research and technical assistance, 6%, and some kind of conservation of any kind, only 5%. Go to the next slide. So then the question is, what do we need agriculture to do to reduce its emissions? And if you go to the next slide, first, what are agricultural emissions? So agriculture emits about, or is responsible for about a quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from deforestation due to ongoing agricultural expansion and the degradation of peatlands, and 14 or 15% come from the production process. In the production process, if you look at all of the right half of this bar, of this circle, that's all related to livestock, and mostly ruminant livestock, mainly cows, sheep, and goats. Fertilizer and all the other things that go into fertilization are about 13%, rice 16%. So it gives you a good idea that you're really focusing very heavily on livestock and deforestation. And so those are the things we need to address. And if you go to the next slide, actually, I'm sorry, I think I was gonna, let me come back to this. Go to the next slide. What are the things that we can do to reduce these emissions? And one of them is boosting productivity. So basically, the challenge we have is that greenhouse gas emissions are likely to rise tremendously. And actually, if you go to the next slide, I think this is where we come back. Yeah, this is where I'm a little out of order here. But if we don't increase crop yields and pasture yields and output per animal, emissions are likely to grow even more than we otherwise would have. So on the left here, the 2010 reference, that's agricultural emissions about 12 gigatons. And by 2050, we're projecting that emissions will rise to about 15 gigatons under business as usual. And to get people to understand that, that's 70% of probably the maximum allowable emissions from all human sources. And we basically have otherwise put out papers suggesting that the world needs to get to 4 gigatons by 2050. So you start at 12, you need to reduce emissions by 2/3, even while producing 50% more food. But if yields actually only continue to increase at the rate of the last couple of decades, our actual emissions are going to go up to 17 gigatons. And if we try to produce all the food we expect we are going to need in 2050 with today's yields and productivity of livestock, emissions would be at 38 gigatons, which is roughly twice the amount of allowable emissions from all human sources. So, okay, so what can we do about it? Let's go back. And so one thing is we need to increase productivity. So in fact, if subsidies do that, that is something that it can be useful. However, for reasons I won't go into right now, frequently when you boost productivity, you actually can clear more forest in the local area. So that increase in productivity needs to be explicitly linked to governance that protects against forest and savanna clearing. And then because of the magnitude of this challenge, there is a huge emphasis we need to place on innovations. There are lots of promising innovations, but they need to be worked through and developed, just as in the energy sector. And then when we take land out of production, we need to do it in a way that maximizes the greenhouse gas benefits. And particularly important are peatlands, which are only half of global agricultural land, but actually contribute 2% of all human emissions. And so re-wetting peatlands is particularly valuable. And when you restore forests, restoring them in natural ways. If you go back, actually, the slide, let me go back now. Let me just briefly say, a lot of the emphasis in agricultural subsidies has been on having less market distorting subsidies so that trade can be less distorted. And that's put pressure to so-called decouple subsidies, meaning that the subsidies aren't tied to exactly what you produce and how much you produce. And the decoupling has made some progress. And one of the things it's resulted in is most countries, there has been some decline in these market price supports and some change in the structure. How that relates to greenhouse gas emissions is ambiguous. We go through the example of New Zealand, where they radically slashed subsidies. New Zealand became much more efficient in all forms of agriculture, economically and from a greenhouse gas standpoint. On the other hand, if you do this in such a way that you shift production into tropical areas or forested areas, you can end up actually increasing emissions. So there's some ambiguity about that. It's probably made some contribution, but it's not going to get us there. Now, we skip the next couple of slides. Okay, so what do we do about market price supports? So market price supports are only these trade barriers, and what do they do for greenhouse gas emissions? And our general view is that they don't do anything useful, and so half can't do anything useful for the simple reason that even if they boost prices for some farmers, they decrease prices for others. And in general, they tend to boost prices for wealthier farmers because that's where you tend to have the largest market price supports. Next slide. And then when you look at the other issues of what is even agricultural subsidies doing for productivity, you see production payments, and that's boosting incomes where the farmers get it. But the vast majority of these production payments tend to go to larger, wealthier farmers who are better able to handle risk anyway. And there's no real evidence that they have actually somehow reduced risk, induced higher productivity gains. So what you're left with are some of these other measures that can boost productivity, but it is certainly a minority of a small minority of the funding. Next slide. So one way support can possibly help protect the environment or climate change is simply by attaching conditions to environmental conditions to the receipt of this aid. And there has been a movement to do that, at least in theory. And if you look at particularly at the production payment bar here, about 40% of all production payments, at least nominally, are tied to some kind of environmental conditions. Like this is more like 47%. And so that's good because that means that there is a structure in place to actually try to get environmental safeguards and benefits out of these subsidies. But when you look in detail at them, we go through them in some detail in the report, the actual fine print is pretty limited. I'll give you a couple of examples where it's probably doing some good later on. Next slide. Conservation programs have been growing, even though they're still small, and they've been growing in part because of support in China. So they've grown for two reasons when you look at the OECD database. One is that China has put a lot more money into reforesting marginal agricultural hilly land and giving payments to kind of reduce grazing pressure on some sensitive grazing lands. And also the EU, a lot of the EU payments are nominally environmental because they're Pillar 2, I think David may talk about this, that are tied to some environmental conditions, but they're pretty mild environmental conditions that we go through. But a key emphasis is that a lot of this money is going toward retiring land that is considered to be somewhat marginal or surplus. And that can have benefits. And we talk about the fact that there have been some benefits places. But one of the limitations is almost all these programs are temporary, so that land can be plowed up again, and therefore you can lose the carbon. There has not been a big enough emphasis on the really valuable lands from a climate perspective of restoring, which are peatlands. And there has been, most of the reforestation has been through plantation forests rather than natural forests, which have, if nothing else, limited biodiversity and ultimately lower amounts of carbon in the long run. Next slide. So what can you actually, what do we do? Now our report actually has a whole number of case studies. So I encourage you to look at it. We have case studies about the US, the EU, China, India, Brazil, and then we just really have just on fertilizer subsidies in Africa. And so they give you, in each of those, we try to identify where some good things are happening. So here are the basic rules and some of the examples. Obviously, one of the main things we're in favor of is redirecting funding into trying to solve climate change, among other things. The biggest challenge is these market price supports. These are subsidies provided by consumers, not by taxpayers. Europe, at one point when it started reducing the market price supports, it actually increased direct payments as an alternative. And one possibility is to lower the market price supports and then provide more aid directly for environmental improvements. A second, and this is really critical, is to, as you provide funding to increase productivity and yields, it has to be conditioned on not clearing more land. And in the US, for example, there have been restrictions on draining wetlands that have been uncertain effect. There's been a program that is somewhat limited to try to reduce the incentive to clear native prairie. But the best example of this, where it seems to have really mattered, is in Brazil, where low-cost loans to farmers were conditioned on complying with the forest code and restricted in municipalities where forest was being cleared. And that seems to have had a real effect. And that's a good model for what needs to be done elsewhere. Not perfect, but had a real effect. A third recommendation is when governments do land retirement, which tends to happen in part because as some farmland becomes marginal, there's just a desire by farmers to take some of that land out of production and get paid for it. And what's important is that targeted land retirement be in the form that can produce the greatest benefits. Peatlands are a good example, rewetting them and then moving to more native forests. China has had the largest programs to reforest land. It has made statements that it is going to move more toward natural forests. That would be a good example. Denmark has proposed to basically retire or to re-wet its peatlands. These are really good examples. Another general rule is to use graduated payments. In other words, that whatever funding providing to farmers for doing good things for the environment or in anything else, pay more the better you do. And that's for a kind of a realistic political reason, which is that if there is a minimum requirement that farmers need to pass to get funding, the political pressure is to set that requirement extremely low. For those of you who remember the old Garrison Keillor, kind of all children are above average, all farmers become above average. So it's much more realistic and better to have a system where the better you do, you get graduated payments. And there are examples for doing that. And among the examples for doing that relate to the next recommendation is that have integrated projects. So in other words, instead of just saying, hey, all this money is available to whoever passes it meets some kind of conditions, you actually have projects that are designed to push things forward. So that we give an example of a project in France where scientists working with large numbers of farmers, the farmers had plans to reduce their pesticide application over time. As they did so, they would get higher payments, and they had technical support to look at the best ways of doing that. Those are the types of projects that really work. In the US, there have been projects to focus land retirement around river systems in a coordinated way. The integration of technical support and technical development with farmers working together on specific problems, that is the best way to move forward. And those are the most valuable projects that we found. I guess I have used graduated payments twice. Prioritizing innovation, this is really critical. In order to get from our 12 gigatons of emissions down to 4, even while we produce 50% more food, we have to innovate. Now, there are lots of promising innovations, low emission rice, for example. There are promising technologies to substitute fertilizer with microbes. There are ways of doing highly precision agriculture that responds to the weather patterns so that you know how much nitrogen has come out of the soil and decide into the growing season how much nitrogen you want to apply. these are examples of things that we have good ideas, could work, and need to be further developed. There is a tendency to support the same old conservation practices, which can do some good, but what we really need to do is to target funding, preferably with these integrated projects with innovation. And the last thing I'll say, which unfortunately I didn't put down here, is another good way to do this is to actually have requirements, so flexible regulations that require that farmers make progress, and then to provide financial support for that. And the reason for that is that otherwise you tend to have a kind of a moral hazard. Those farmers who are already doing something or would have some benefit, would do something good anyway, they're the ones who apply for funding, and the funding actually mostly doesn't create additional improvement. And then meanwhile, you can also have leakage where then other farmers do kind of the things you're trying to avoid. If you phase in requirements for improvement and then use government support to help fund that, you are likely to get more progress overall. So those are some of the recommendations, and we can turn it over to the next speaker.
Thanks very much, Tim. So we will next hear from David Baldock, who is a senior fellow with the Institute for European Environmental Policy, and will be talking to us about what's happening in the European context. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Could I have my first slide? I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about Europe as it was and as it might be. And just as a quick picture of where the Common Agricultural Policy stands under roughly the current model, its distinctive features compared with other parts of the world are its high level of expenditure. There's quite a bit of market support still, and there's quite a lot of decoupled payments that Tim mentioned in that second bar there. And those are basically area payments made per hectare, irrespective of whether the farmer produces anything, but they do retain the land in agricultural use. So they have an important function in terms of land use, and therefore in terms of how far we're able to change land use and sequester carbon differently, as Tim was saying. And then there has been quite a long history of conservation programs which haven't grown as fast as you might expect. They started earlier than most other parts of the world, haven't grown so much. If we go to the next slide, please. This just shows us the composition of agricultural emissions in the EU. And I think just the point to make here is that they are even more accentuated around livestock production than in the average. And in particular, you see the enteric fermentation, the green pie slice there, which is essentially from ruminants, and quite a lot of the blue slice on the other side also derives from livestock production through manure and indeed crops produced for livestock feed. So livestock at the center of the debate around greenhouse gas emissions in Europe in particular. Okay, we can probably move on from the slides then. Thank you. And just say the position now is that the current Common Agricultural Policy is coming to an end, and it will be replaced either in 22 or 23 by a new policy. And there's an exciting opportunity in Europe, not least because under the new Commission, Green Deal has been agreed for Europe, and as part of that, the EU is aiming to hit net zero by 2050. To reduce emissions by 40% or hopefully 50 or even 55% by 2030. So we've got some big picture goals, and they've been reinforced by a new set of policies which have emerged in the last few months, one called the Food to Fork strategy. And that is talking about quite significant changes towards sustainability in agriculture and supply chains and in food consumption as well, with the kind of elements which would include 50% reduction in pesticide input consumption by 2030, 50% less food waste is the aim, 50% less nutrients lost in agricultural systems, and so forth. And that's in turn accompanied by a biodiversity strategy, which is talking about protecting 30% of the terrestrial environment for conservation. So if we were able to meet those sort of goals by 2030, we'd be talking about a pretty radical step towards a greener, more sustainable farm landscape and a more climate efficient food system. And alongside that, there's been a much intensified discussion around trying to make diets more sustainable as well, both in health terms and ultimately in environmental terms. Now, how does this read across, these new set of goals read across into the actual propositions for agricultural policy, which remain relatively familiar looking? So the CAP proposals for the next stage were drawn up in 2018, and they have not been overhauls in line with the kind of propositions we're getting from food to fork. What the Commission has proposed essentially is to keep the existing toolbox fairly similar to what it is now. There are some changes. The budget will be fairly similar to what it is now. It hasn't had the ups and downs we've seen in the US for the next 7 years. But the model whereby the governance works will be changed substantially so that individual countries, the EU member states, have to, in principle, meet targets that are relevant to the agricultural system by 2030, and they have to show at the EU level that the payments they're proposing to use, the way they're using the common toolbox, will add up to a set of results which help to meet European targets, including these quite strong environmental targets, including the climate targets. So the member states would have to adjust their existing programs quite substantially in order to meet these sort of targets. And the question is, will they do this? Will this method of trying to distribute responsibility away from Brussels come off? And there are some promising signs. For example, there are some governments, Tim's mentioned Denmark, the Netherlands has been looking at some quite radical changes to their approach within the existing structure. Other countries have shown considerable caution about wanting to do anything like that. And the way that money is distributed in the CAP between countries remains unchanged, so that the budget for Denmark, for example, for the agriculture policy is locked in, and the same for Bulgaria and Romania. So you can't shift money around Europe to target it on the areas where it would make the greatest benefit at the margin environmentally. And in addition to that, the way that the toolbox is being constructed, there's still a fairly similar distribution between the Pillar 1 and the Pillar 2. So the Pillar 2 element, which is more explicitly to do with rural development and environment, has not been particularly expanded. And some of the conditions that Tim mentioned earlier on are in place, but they're not necessarily any stronger than they were before. And there's considerable discretion for the individual member states to pursue their own versions of this. And they will come to Brussels, to the Commission, with their CAP, their national strategic plans, and these will be presented, these will be scrutinized, and either they'll be agreed or they won't be. And then there's a question about whether the indicators, the way that this system will work, will produce the results that we're looking for. And this is an interesting, slightly more technical point, is that the system is designed around indicators which are results, which means that's the participation in schemes, not the actual impact on the ground in measured in environmental terms, like, for example, area of land retired or tons of carbon sequestered or anything like that. So the metrics here are not really advancing at the same pace, and the governance machinery is still a little upstream from the actual result we want on the ground. So we've got a very interesting global experiment coming up in the EU. Can these higher levels of ambition, which are, you know, to be applauded, some of those public goods rhetoric is coming much closer to the policy goals, can that be translated into 27 countries moving in this direction or not? It's going to be a pretty interesting few years. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And we'll next hear from Ann Tutwiler, who is here in her role as coordinator of the Policy Action Coalition to repurpose support to food and agriculture. Ann, thanks for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here. And Tim and I have had a number of conversations about this paper over the last couple of months, so it's exciting to see it published. Before I talk about the Policy Action Coalition, I just want to make 4 quick points about the paper, which I thought was very useful, especially looking at kind of what works and the country deep dives. But I have some concerns when we talk about productivity, because I worry that it takes us back to kind of a green revolution narrative. And I think we need to be expanding what we think about productivity to include issues like sustainability, resilience. When you talk about efficiency of natural resources, it has to include the quality issues, not just sort of the crop per drop. So I think, you know, as we communicate this and think about how we talk about it, it needs a bit broader frame. The second point I wanted to make is you talk about what works, and I think that's really useful to have those concrete examples, but I think is in terms of what policymakers want to know is, where's my biggest bang for the buck? You know, how much should I be putting into conservation? How much should I be putting into natural resources? How much should I put into R&D, for example, and where do I get the big bang, you know, out of moving money from one of those categories to another? And it's really not just only about, you know, how much money we're spending in R&D. The CG system is looking at, under the Commission on Sustainable Ag Intensification, or COSI, is looking at, you know, what are we spending that research money on? And in general, it's not on sustainability. It's not on sustainable solutions. It's not on climate-friendly solutions. So I think that level of detail, you know, countries need to think about, get into. The third area maybe is, you know, obviously this paper was designed to talk about climate change, and it does that very, very well. But you know, policymakers need to consider a lot of other issues around, you know, social justice, social equity, livelihoods, nutrition, biodiversity, which Tim did mention. So I think the next paper, Tim, is to try to help governments understand, you know, what those trade-offs are. If they target climate change, what are they going to impact on these other things? And where are the, you know, as we always talk about, the win-wins or the triple wins? And then lastly, I think this issue that you've raised about efficiency, you know, in general, we've always thought that larger farmers are more efficient, you know, but we also understand kind of the dangers that large farms hold for environmental outcomes and maybe social outcomes, et cetera. So how do we, you know, help make the smaller farmers, the mid-sized farmers, more efficient in all of these ways that I've been talking about, you know, not just, you know, crop per drop or yield per hectare, because I think that's going to be one of the big trade-offs when you talk about, you know, how to increase global food production. So if you could bring out the slides now, those are just my general comments on the paper, which I did think was really great. So I'm here in my role as the coordinator for the Policy Action Coalition, which is part of the Just Rural Transition, which was launched by the UK government last year at the UN Climate Summit. And I'm not going to go through these, they're very wordy slides, but I think they'll be available for everyone to see. So this Just Rural Transition is a very large sort of community of practice that's focusing on these various goals of, you know, improving agriculture systems, food systems, and really pushing this transformation in the food and ag sector that we've all been talking about. So next slide. And here's just the members of the Just Rural Transition, just so you can get a sense of how broad this coalition is, and there have been updates and you know, membership in the governments that are supportive. Next slide. So this is where I want to spend my time. So I am leading a policy action coalition to repurpose and reinvest support to the food and ag sector. And this is a coalition of the willing. So we've had a couple of questions about the political economy. These are countries who have put their hand up and they've said, we realize we are not doing a good job in how we support our farmers in terms of delivering on these other goals around climate change, environment, nutrition, et cetera. And the Policy Action Coalition's purpose is to support those countries in their journey of repurposing those food and ag policies by helping provide analytical support, advice about trade-offs, illuminating those trade-offs, supporting sort of the political economy dialogues and conversations that need to be happening at the country level as countries, you know, try to determine how to move forward, and creating peer-to-peer learning opportunities for countries who have made more progress and those who, you know, are still sort of knowing they need to move but haven't moved yet. One of the key partners of the Policy Action Coalition is the World Bank, who is committing a big chunk of funding to support developing countries who want to move forward in these directions. And if you go to the next slide. So right now we have these countries' government partners who have formally signed up to be part of the Policy Action Coalition, the World Bank, and we are identifying another 15 or so countries who are anxious to move forward on this path. And just to conclude, I think, you know, one of the things that's interesting for me, having been in this world for a long time, is the ownership that a number of countries are taking and the recognition that the need to do this. This is not coming from the WTO. It's not coming from, you know, international institutions saying you need to do this. Not coming from the Cairns Group lobbying for, you know, supports. It's really internally driven by these countries. And the last thing I'll say is I think this agenda about repurposing is really important, because previously we've been talking about, you know, the need to take support out of the agriculture. And really the message is, you know, the farm sector, the food sector provides important services and important public goods, and it deserves some share of government public support. But we need to provide public support to deliver on public goods. And I think that's a very different conversation to have than what we had in the past. So thank you. I'll leave it there, and these slides will be available. And if you go to the last slide, I've also included ways to follow the Just Rural Transition and get in additional information. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne, and thanks to David and Tim as well. So we're now going to turn to the Q&A portion of our webinar. I think we've had a lot of questions coming in, so hopefully you're familiar with how to submit questions, but if not, you just type it into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as we can until the hour is up. So this first question I actually want to direct to all of our speakers. This was a theme that came out in a lot of your presentations, but perhaps you can expand on. This question is, why have some countries moved faster and more widely in redirecting subsidies toward environmental outcomes? What are the variables in political economy that explain these differences? And importantly, what are the drivers that could accelerate needed change? Tim, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, well, I first said there aren't a lot of examples of really shifting money. So the most dramatic example of changing subsidies was New Zealand, which basically just got rid of the vast majority of the subsidies because they cost too much. And you do see changes in places where there are high environmental pressures. So in Brazil, it's under pressure to reduce its emissions and stop deforestation. And they realized that conditioning subsidies on doing that was a good way to do it, at least when the government was interested in achieving that goal. So in China, I think there is been a recognition that they have this huge amount of nitrogen pollution, and they got rid of their fertilizer subsidies. And I think that was partially a result of that, and partially a result of the costs, and realized it wasn't really doing any good. And they've started putting some money into these other things, and they've responded to the sheer fact that a lot of this farmland was becoming marginal. You know, the huge erosion in the West is also a big source of air pollution, even in Beijing. So I think where there are specific environmental pressures, there have been efforts, and I think that's why maybe the EU is the most likely candidate to have a big change. One other example, in India has spent huge amounts of money on fertilizer subsidies and grossly overuses fertilizer and has a mismatch of nitrogen fertilizer with other fertilizers, and probably in a way that undermines yields. And so they moved to actually require that nitrogen fertilizer be sold with neem, which is designed to reduce nitrogen use. There's a debate about whether or not this actually worked. But so I do think that where there are specific strong environmental pressures, sometimes there is a shift, a pressure toward a shift.
If I could also add on that, you know, we're also seeing a shift in the UK, in large part, only part maybe because of Brexit. They had to come up with a new agricultural policy, and it's been a combination of environmental pressures. Tim, I agree with that. You know, financial pressures, but also, you know, changes in what consumers are expecting from the sector, I think has been, in some of these countries, has played a big role in how they're, you know, rethinking what they want. And I would argue that, you know, COVID has also shown a lot of the weaknesses, vulnerabilities, fragility of the system that is now visible to consumers in a way it hasn't been in a number of countries. So I think that consumer or citizen, if I can call it that, pressure will also be helping move some countries.
Yeah, just to add, I think the citizen role has been pretty important in quite a few countries, certainly in Europe. And I agree with Tim that it's in areas where you've got the most intensive agriculture, including parts of China, that often the negative impacts have become most apparent, and therefore action's been precipitated. But another thing that's been helpful, certainly in Europe, is where there have been binding targets. So if we have a binding target for reducing emissions by a certain date, this does focus the mind on the role of all sectors. And agriculture often escapes the more sort of generic type of obligations. But when there's a formal binding target with a timetable, that has bite. And you've seen that in Germany, for example, where they have such a thing. You've seen that in the UK.
Thanks, David. Our next question is, and Tim, I'm going to direct this one to you first. How can we ensure that any reduction of funding and market price support also contributes to the global goal of reducing beef consumption?
Yeah, or consumption generally. So the answer is it's not clear how you do that. And one possibility as we move forward is if plant-based meat soon becomes cheaper or as expensive as beef, for example, it would be good to have a lot of support for that development, particularly in the 80% of the world that eats very, very little beef, and is if it starts consuming anything significantly more, will have a huge global effect. But the challenge, this is a big issue, which is that it's too complicated an issue to go into whole detail here, but greenhouse gas emissions in countries are measured by their production, not their consumption. And so shifting your consumption doesn't by itself result in reduced emissions. And in fact, we don't necessarily want it to, in the sense that we want everyone to reduce their consumption, but if a country is very efficient at producing from a greenhouse gas standpoint or environmental standpoint at producing a particular meat, we want it to do that, continue to do that. So this is a broader issue, but the fact that our accounting rules for climate do not incentivize changes in consumption is a broad challenge. And that means that, for example, the pressures that David was talking about that could be brought to bear won't really apply.
If I could just add to that, I think that one important route to doing this will be through a parallel dialogue on food, health, and so-called sustainable diets, which is certainly taking off in some parts of the world. There have been big studies published by the Lancet and others showing that a healthier diet is one with a lower proportion of livestock products, dairy and meat in it. And I think this message is starting to get across. How you translate that into individual behavior, how dirigiste you want to be is a big question. But I think that dialogue has to be on the table. It has to be a message. And certainly some of the bigger food companies like Unilever have understood that that is going to be one of the criteria. They're going to be judged by it as well. And so they will see developments in the market, as Tim mentioned, with synthetic meat. And the market will probably play a big role here. But agriculture in a box probably won't move on without that parallel bigger picture thinking around food systems.
Yeah, Jillian, I just wanted to add, I mean, when we talk about these issues around meat consumption, and we talk about it at a global level, and we're often focused on the overconsumption of meat and the diets in OECD countries. And we also have to recognize that, some of these regions where meat production is not so efficient, it is also a source of wealth. It's a source of employment. It's a source of income for women. It's a livelihoods issue, et cetera. And that many people in many parts of the world are not eating enough animal protein. And so, I just want to add that, because when we talk about these issues, we focus on the global, but when you get down to country level, there are a lot of other complexities.
Yeah, and if I could build on that, that's so when we start thinking, I mean, the report doesn't focus that heavily on subsidies in poorer countries because they're lower. But in Africa, for example, where people really need to eat more livestock products as a whole, there is a gigantic difference in the environmental costs and, frankly, the amount of food you can provide, focusing on chicken and eggs rather than beef. But there is some pressure to expand beef production for an export market, which would have huge environmental implications and produce very little food. So one of the issues is we want existing dairy production to be supported and becoming more efficient, better feed and all this kind of thing. But we really want, from an environmental standpoint, we want the support to go into the far more efficient, both for feeding people and for the environment, forms of livestock products.
Thank you. This next question is, what's your opinion on carbon cap and trade system?
Yeah, so for agriculture, it's really hard. for a lot of reasons. I mean, one is that we simply can't measure emissions in the same way that with the same, to the individual cow, to the individual farm, in the same way that you can with energy sector. So actually, this is not so much something we talk about in this World Bank report. We do have a discussion of this in the Big WRI report, Creating a Sustainable Food Future, quite a long discussion in the policy section. And what we recommend there are surrogates, things that try to create some of the same benefits with the kind of flexible approach to reductions that are feasible. So here are a couple of examples. We recommend that fertilizer manufacturers be responsible for increasing the share of fertilizer that they sell in combination with compounds like nitrification inhibitors that reduce their pollution load, including their greenhouse gas load. We recommend that integrated or large ultimate sellers and purchasers of meat products, such as the pork industry in the US, that they be responsible for reducing methane and other emissions from the manure management of their farms, and to phase that in so that they start by working at the where it's easiest to do that and learn as improve beyond that. So I think that there are ways that are feasible to get the benefits of kind of flexible regulation without that are actually feasible in the agricultural sector. And one thing that may help make that happen is if some of these subsidies are actually used to support some of these efforts. But if you have, which I spoke about before, like to help farmers switch their nitrogen compounds, for example. So it's a complicated topic, but that's the basic answer.
Thanks, Tim. This next question, Anne, I'm going to direct to you first. Given challenges of knowledge and subsidy distribution, what policies can best reach nearly 1 billion small farmers in the world?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer at a general level. A lot of the payments, as has been said in sort of traditional systems, tend to go to larger farms and actually have encouraged consolidation of farms. And we've seen that, very much in the US and Europe. I think when we look at, smallholder farmers, one of the areas that they are always particularly challenged is around, financing and getting adequate finance in advance of planting season to, support their production. And so I think, one of the areas, if we can think about it, is to help, smallholder farmers get increased access to finance and, risk management tools. What we hear from a lot of smallholder producers is, these issues around risk management, risk mitigation. So I think that would be another area. The third is, there are ways to design fertilizer subsidies, for lack of, and seed input subsidies that get directly to smallholder farmers to help them, in their planting, rather than go to the fertilizer companies or big farms. So I think it gets down to, the details of how you design those policies in a particular area. So I think I would, leave it there. Tim may have some other thoughts on how you actually design a set of policies to get directly to smallholders. I just would say the other thing, Tim made a comment about the fact that, we haven't focused much on developing countries or Africa because they don't give much subsidies. And that's true, they don't, but what they do is tax their farmers. There's still a lot of those countries that have policies that prevent smallholder farmers from benefiting when the price of food rises, so they don't get signals to produce more when there's demand. So I think reversing some of that negative taxation has to also be part of this conversation that when we talk about repurposing support, because we are actually dis-supporting some farmers in the most vulnerable countries.
It's such a big question. I'll just say that we do have a discussion of fertilizer subsidies in Africa, which are an effort in theory to get to smaller farmers, but they haven't been very successful. First of all, they tend to not just get to small farmers, they often get to the larger and smaller farmers or larger farmers. And secondly, a lot of it has simply displaced other fertilizer consumption. And this is actually an example where the programs that seem to work better are programs that don't actually subsidize the fertilizer per se, but subsidize the development and market of it so that the price of fertilizer goes down. Because after all, if you lower the fertilizer price by 2/3, that's even better than being subsidized by 50% of the fertilizer cost. So, and then the other issue though is that there's been too much emphasis on fertilizer, and a lot of the fertilizer hasn't actually produced a huge output benefit, and you needed to have a broader area. But the challenge, of course, is these countries don't have a lot of money, and so everyone is still looking for what is the most useful uses of these funds. The country that has gained a lot of success in the last decade has been Ethiopia. And I think one of the interesting questions is, what has Ethiopia really done that's been so successful? And I think that analysis remains to be written properly.
Thank you both. This last question I'm going to direct to David, and then we'll wrap up with some parting thoughts from our speakers, a kind of final thing to leave us with. David, why is the focus on production emissions when, if food loss and waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter?
Food waste is a huge issue. It's very differentiated problem in the poorer parts of the world and many, many developing countries. The greatest portion of waste occurs at the farm level, at the storage level, and sometimes supply chain level, whereas in the OECD countries, most of the waste is actually the household level at the consumer end of the food chain. So we have a bunch of very different issues inside the food waste envelope. And I think there is a lot of scope, particularly for moving resources into reducing waste in the developing world at farm level. This can be pretty challenging given climatic conditions, resources available, and so forth. In the developed world, I think we're looking at rather more subtle forms of intervention. Sometimes we can try to legislate, we can put targets onto companies, we can try to deal with specific forms of waste, we can educate people, but we also have challenges that there's a lot of food waste in the catered sector, for example, and if people are eating out of their homes more, that's a structural change which is not so easy to deal with. So I think it's not either or, in short. We certainly should address the full spectrum of food waste issues, but I don't think we can rely on success. I don't think success will be sufficient. So we do need to, at the same time, address the production issues across the board as well, I think.
Thanks, David. And so just now to have some parting thoughts, one quick thing from each of you. Tim, David, then Anne.
Well, people are looking at people's questions, and a lot of these are broader questions about the food system. For livestock production, there are a lot of questions, and I will just offer this one thought. We both simultaneously need to hold down consumption of livestock products, and above all, ruminant products. And we need to ensure that what is produced with reduced emissions. And that requires better feed efficiency for those, particularly in most of the world where it is not that great. And B, it requires innovations. So for example, we soon should have a additive that can be used to reduce enteric methane. So, and then, as I said, if plant-based meat alternatives become cheaper soon, or as cheap, then having governments really invest in those as opposed to conventional livestock production is very important. That can be done on the consumer side, but we do need to do both. And it's a longer discussion, so I'll invite people to think about this, because we're going to write about this more. This dichotomy between the pressure or the reward for reducing production emissions and the lack of reward for reducing consumption is a huge challenge for climate change globally, and it applies to the agricultural sector and food quite a lot. And so that's an issue that, just to flag for people, that we're going to have to deal with down the road.
I just want to pick up for a second Anne's point right at the beginning of her remarks about productivity and seeing the whole climate mitigation struggle in a bigger context. And you're right, of course, we do have to attend to social justice, we have to attend to the fight against poverty, we have to deal with the complementary but sometimes rather different challenge of preserving biodiversity. And it's just worth saying that I think we're going to have to invest more in some of these trade-offs. So if you look at, for example, highly productive, efficient systems and highly intensive chicken farms, for example, chickens living a very short number of weeks, very energy efficient. These produce absolutely zero public goods whatsoever, and a certain amount of environmental costs. So in terms of having the mix of different production systems that we want, and they're getting their location right and the chain right, we've got some real work to do, and avoid giving consumers the impression that, you know, everything they want can be achieved by selecting chicken on the menu or selecting something else. It's a more difficult problem than that.
I just want to clarify one thing, just to be clear. When we talk about productivity, we're really talking about natural resource productivity. So it's not just per hectare, it's per everything. And so that's where you have this combination of increased output per hectare, but then shifts in the production method to reduce the other emissions, where innovation is even more needed. So just to clarify that.
Thank you. Anne?
Yeah, you hate to be the last speaker, but just to pick up on what Tim just said, you know, yes, it's the natural resource productivity, but you also need to think, you know, if you increase the efficiency of water, for example, in a system, you can increase the demand for water and actually ruin the aquifer. And so I think it needs to be a broader concept, and maybe that is what I can leave with is, I mean, David made the comment about the trade-offs, but I think we need to make sure that the goals that we're setting and the metrics that we're setting actually capture and minimize the chances for these kind of negative externalities or unforeseen externalities when we go to policymakers and say, here's the kind of advice we want to provide. But I think, Tim, I really hope the next paper can be looking at these trade-offs, because I think that's where the political economy is.
Just say that we have a whole, in our larger report, Creating a Sustainable Food Future, we have a whole major part of that, which is about exactly what you're talking about. How do you deal with the kind of rebound effects? And the way to think about this is to say, you need the efficiency gain without the rebound effect. Because if you can't, you know, if you're not more efficient, for example, in your use of water, you're simply either not going to eat, or you're going to use more water. So you need the efficiency gain, but it isn't sufficient. So this is where most of these things have to be coupled with governance. Yeah. And I will say that if there's one single simple thing to do with all agricultural support, is to condition the support on not clearing more land. And so that linkage is an example of where you kind of use your agricultural support to achieve this. And you could think about extending that to water as well, we're going to help you be more efficient, but then you can't use more. So you can think of those kinds of conditions as some of the most basic things that can be done.
Great, thank you. We will have to leave it there. We are a few minutes over. I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank you, the audience. You can find our blog on this topic with a link to the paper that we've just discussed by visiting wri.org/food. And just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on WRI's website in the events tab within a couple days. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.